Hello, book lovers, and welcome to another episode of Authors Love Bookstores from a Mighty Blaze. I'm Joe Moldover, your host for this afternoon, and I am delighted to be with you for episode number 150. Over 150 episodes, my partner Kimberly Hensel Lawrence and I have visited independent bookstores and the authors who love them in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, Canada, and the UK. And today we are delighted to be visiting P&T Knitwear in New York City with Events and Outreach Manager Joseph Demas and author Anne Burt. Anne and Joe, welcome to the show. I'm delighted to have you here.
Happy to be here, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Congratulations on 150. That's a fantastic
Yeah.
number.
Thank you. It's a nice round number. For those who don't know, Anne Burt is the author of The Dig, a March 2023 American Booksellers Association Indie Next, and a fantastic cover, as we can see. Anne holds an MFA from NYU and has edited several collections, as well as placing short pieces in Salon, with NPR, and elsewhere. Anne, congratulations on your fiction debut with The Dig.
Thank you.
So Anne, the reason that we are with P&T Knitwear today is that you selected them as your independent books seller to appear next to on the show. Tell us a little bit about why. What's so great about this bookstore?
Yeah. So many things are amazing about P&T Knitwear. I'm really excited to talk about it. But I want to start by talking about how I found P&T Knitwear, because you guys have not been open all that long. It's just been almost 2 years, I think. So is that right, Joe? Yeah. So this was about maybe 6 or 8 months before The Dig was about to be published. And I was on the Lower East Side. I live in New York, but not on the Lower East Side. But I was wandering around the Lower East Side with a very good friend of mine who was there doing sort of digging up her own family history and was looking for the tenement building where her great-great-grandmother lived and was, in fact, a sewer of some kind and worked in a garment factory. So we were wandering around the Lower East Side, and I saw P&T Knitwear, this independent bookstore, and I always go into independent bookstores. I mean, every writer loves to go into any bookstore, anytime, anywhere. But one of the things that was so appealing was it was bright and beautiful and like big, tall walls. And I walked into this amazing bookstore with this amazing selection, and I saw the stage set where they have readings, and there was nothing else like it that I had seen in another independent bookstore. It's like a raked amphitheater inside the bookstore instead of just folding chairs. It's just beautifully designed for exactly what kind of reading a person would want to have. And I immediately thought, if I could do my New York launch in this bookstore, I would be so thrilled. And then I met Julie, who's the owner, and she said, that sounds great. We talked about The Dig. She looked it up. She said, we're super interested. And it all worked out from there. The other thing that was really an amazing coincidence is as I walked in there, my cousin, Stephanie Burt, who is a very well-known poet and poetry critic, had just had a reading there, and her name was kind of up on the marquee. And so I just felt like this place was welcoming me in every possible way. And I was so thrilled in March to be able to do my New York debut reading at P&T Knitwear with all of you.
Awesome. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Joe, it seems like P&T is not just your traditional bookstore. You have an interesting history, and then it seems like a very interesting space and mission. Will you just tell our audience a little bit more about the store?
Certainly. So the store opened in late May of 2022. Our owner, who also helps run the Gotham Book Prize, which is an award that celebrates the best work of the past year, either fiction or nonfiction, written about or set in New York. At the start of the pandemic, became sort of really aware of how many bookstores were on the verge of foreclosure or were foreclosing. And Bradley himself is a very big reader, and was, like many people who love books and frequent bookstores, quite alarmed by the precarity that most bookstores operate under, and wanted to see what a bookstore could do if it sort of had the backing that many bookstores don't. What kind of resources could it offer? What could it do with programming and in general, without being kind of constrained by the really, really thin margins that most bookstores operate under. And our name and location also are pretty tied closely to Bradley's personal history. So his grandfather, Jaime Tusk, co-opened a menswear clothing store in around 1952 with a man named Mike Pudlow, who he met in a displaced persons camp after the Holocaust. Both of them were survivors. They immigrated to New York City and opened this clothing store, which was called P&T Knitwear for their last name initials. And so that was a big motivator for Bradley to open on the Lower East Side to sort of give homage to that history of establishments having longevity and being a kind of building the history of a place as it emerges out of, I mean, especially given the circumstances of 2020, out of real hardship. So that's really what we are. We're a general news bookstore. We do have some used titles, and we do, as it makes sense with the tie-in for the book prize, we do have a selection that focuses on books set in or about New York, so New York fiction and nonfiction. That's us in a nutshell.
Well, and as Margaret over on YouTube is pointing out, the overall title, it's a conversation starter. You're the bookstore. I get coffee. Tell us about being a podcast studio.
Yeah. So Bradley also has his own podcast called Firewall, and wanted to, as thinking about a bookstore as essentially a community resource, or another way of thinking about it as a third space, which, if for anyone who's not familiar with that kind of term, it's places where people can gather and meet, and where there isn't also the kind of pressure or constraints of capitalism or commercialism. So oftentimes it's a tavern or a town hall. I think by and large, many bookstores do operate as a third space, even though they are businesses. If you remember the halcyon days of Borders and Barnes and Nobles, when you could just sit for hours and read, and no one was going to really bother you or ask you how you were doing with the intent to sell you something. That essentially is what a bookstore is meant to do. But so apart from that, because a lot of people do have podcasts, and also because it is the entry barrier is kind of high in terms of equipment and that resource, Bradley thought that might be a nice thing to add into it. It also allows us to, record our events, archive them for future use. But yeah, so built under the amphitheater that Anne mentioned is the studio. It's a 4-mic setup. It's all pre-production, so we have a mixer and computer video camera to bring people in through Zoom, and it's free to use and open to the public. There's a registration page on our website, and it's been, as you can imagine, since we opened, quite busy. Our podcast manager, Serge, who's next to me, kind of always has his hands full working the requests.
It's fantastic. Very cool. Sounds like an amazing space. I agree with Margaret. I wish I could just pop in. And Katie over on Facebook is looking at some of our descriptions of the book, and Katie, the book is good. Let's spend a few minutes talking about that, and talk to us a little bit about The Dig. If you would, just give us sort of the elevator pitch on this one. I've several questions I want to ask you about it in the background, but just for people who might not be familiar, just give us the lowdown about this book.
Right, here it is again. The Dig. So The Dig is a contemporarily inspired telling of the Antigone myth. You don't have to know Antigone to read The Dig, but it does come from the same genesis of the idea of Antigone. So The Dig, I'll go back to Antigone in a minute, but The Dig is set in 2014 Minnesota. A young woman who is a newly minted lawyer in Minneapolis gets a call from her adoptive uncle in the small northwestern Minneapolis town where she and her brother was raised. Says, your brother's gone missing. You have to come back and help me figure out what happened to him. Now, the main character, Antonia, She and her brother were Bosnian war orphans in the 1993 siege of Sarajevo, and their adoptive uncle was an American contractor who found them in a bombed-out building in Sarajevo, brought them back and raised them alongside their own children. But now in her mid-20s, Antonia is called back to this very small, very kind of town where a lot of people from quote unquote outside are not viewed with such warmth. So there is a newly minted Somali community, as there are many across Minnesota in the early 2000s and 2010s. A Somali community has made its residence in Thebes, Minnesota. They have put up a community center, and Antonia's uncle is the owner of a construction company. They have declared eminent domain over the space where the community center is. Antonia's brother Paul was defending the rights of the Somali community to have that community center in defiance of his uncle. Police action broke out, and that's why he went missing. So when Antonia comes back to Thebes, she learns over the course of a single day not only what happened to her brother in all of this, but also secrets and lies about her own past in Bosnia and what happened to her birth mother. So it's constructed as literary suspense, and it really digs in, as the title says, to what it means to have a history that you are at odds with, to grow as a result of having to learn about that history, and through these characters and through a pretty propulsive plot, looks at what happens when there are clashes of communities in small towns in the Midwestern United States from all over the globe.
Mm. It's a great concept. It's a great pitch. I want to ask you a little bit more about Antigone. So, Antigone is, an ancient play, and thematically, it's kind of about the quote, the laws of man colliding with God's law, or with sort of a higher law, or higher morality.
Yeah.
Well, in another interview, I know you said that Antigone really kind of got its hooks into you when you were in your 20s, and you saw a choreographed production, I guess, sort of a choreographed interpretation of Antigone. But what do you think it is about this play that sort of, or this story that has kind of, not let go of you, and made its way into your fiction?
Yeah. So the main character of Antigone is a young woman who is forced, because of all of both her passions and loves for family members, for her fiance, and because of her struggle with what, in ancient times they called, as you said, God's law versus man's law, but what I would certainly call today her moral and ethical center, in the face of something that is declared legal, but might not actually resonate as being ethical. I don't have to enumerate how often this comes up in our political discourse today, in our personal lives. And I think because she, as this young person, had to make decisions and act on them. And that's really unusual for a female character to, out of ancient Western canon, to be so central in terms of, she's the hinge on which all the action happens. And it's her choices, her decisions, and her choice to decide, these are my ethics, I'm going to follow them, that makes everything else spin out. And I think I've never quite let go of that idea. It's so translatable to so many things. I think some people might recall, when in 2018, when Black Lives Matter was really coming to the fore, and there was a lot of things going on. There were a lot of productions of Antigone that actually arose out of community areas. There was a production called Antigone in Ferguson that was resetting Antigone in Ferguson, actually, Ferguson, Minnesota. And that was a really powerful piece. There's an incredible theater company called Theater of War. And they moved during the pandemic to all online also. And they were organized to actually work with veterans of wars to adapt drama that centered, PTSD and war trauma and war decision-making in these theater pieces and then bring in veterans to really talk about what this is like. They created a version called The Nurse Antigone, which was a 45-minute version of Antigone, all done online. And they had actors reading a truncated version of the parts. And they had nurses and healthcare workers from different communities reading the chorus, the Greek chorus. And they related the Antigone story about moral and ethical justice to the healthcare system and how that's happening. So it's an incredibly moving piece of drama and literature. And I took my shot at it and my spin on it. And it was really an incredibly moving opportunity to do that after having thought about it for so many years.
Yeah, absolutely. To the audience, those of us who are with us now live, thank you. Also, those of you in future time, just a reminder, links are below us to pick up a copy of The Dig through P&T Knitwear. You can buy from the store, have it sent to you wherever you happen to be, support independent book selling, and pick up a fabulous new book. So please, if you can, make use of those links.
Yeah, I think P&T Knitwear has some signed copies still of The Dig there. So last I checked.
I was going to mention that. That's fantastic. Joe, question for you as a bookseller on hand. So The Dig is, in some ways, I mean, it's inspired by Antigone, and I don't know if it's a stretch to call it sort of a contemporary retelling, but I mean, do you think that sort of contemporary retellings or new takes on ancient works are a hot area right now from a market point of view? Is that something that you're seeing bubbling up quite a bit in terms of the publishing world?
I think so, to a certain degree. I mean, even not thinking about retellings of works of antiquity, you have, Hernan Diaz, Trust, which is won the Pulitzer Prize, and which is essentially, we had the pleasure of hosting him around the release of the paperback version of it, and he essentially called it, it's a response to The Great Gatsby, and sort of its nested structure is trying to pick apart the idea of narrative about wealth, and how that itself is a construct, and how in trying to create an alternate narrative about, the ultra wealthy, or maybe how the ultra wealthy try to do it about themselves, of, sort of forging a path on their own through the trials and tribulations of life, or what have you, that it actually, there are consequences, and there's a lot of ramifications to their actions, and that, there are also actually people who are making decisions, some good, some not. But there's also like the classic examples, Anne Carson. She just put out H of H Playbook, which is I believe a retelling of the Trials of Hercules that came out last year. I mean, she's got a new original work coming out soon, but I mean, she is somebody who has never been out of demand. And I think in general, because there are so many people writing books, to a certain extent, every story is a retelling of some story, because there's like there are only 7 archetypal types of stories. I think, to say, I don't think it's a small part of the book world from a marketing perspective, because books are always trying to re-examine the past, or even re-examine the near past, what we could call the contemporary moment, however far back you define that. It's a kind of, it's an ongoing thing. I think generally speaking, most booksellers think about literature in general as a kind of a dialectical thing, of that it's always in conversation with history, that there aren't books that are really created out of a vacuum, even books that seem sort of like in a fabulist tradition, or a real speculative tradition. Those all kind of come out of history, as does, I think, all art.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And that's exactly the phrase that sort of came to my mind when Anne was talking, this idea of being sort of one work of art being in conversation with another. And Joe refers to the sort of the different story archetypes. Your book is it's a family story. It has historical elements. I think in terms of genre, though, I think it would be considered to be sort of a suspense or a thriller. Um, a lot of the people who watch this show are themselves aspiring writers. And let's talk about that for a second. What are the essential elements of writing a good thriller? I mean, I think that your book, it has a ticking clock. You know, there has some time compression, so there's a ticking clock to it. There are high stakes. What else? What do you need to do to kind of make that, to make the editors sit up and recognize it as a thriller?
Yeah. There's so many elements that transcend genre here for sure. But yeah, I think exactly what you talked about, like a ticking clock. And if people don't know what that means, that just means setting up to be more kind of craft oriented for the writers in saying that, set up some kind of test very close to the beginning of the book where, if you don't find X by 3:30 p.m., the whole world will implode, something along those lines. And it can be anything. Just an if then is a really powerful hook for any reader, and I think in any genre, but especially in literary suspense, which I think The Dig falls into. It really keeps the pages turning, and it helps you as a writer understand what marks you have to hit. So that is definitely a big element. Another element is being very careful to make choices about where you end your chapters and where you begin your next chapters. So one really important element to think about is each chapter is almost a mini sort of solving of a small mystery, but before you end, you have to open up a new mystery. So it's like you set somebody up so you have some satisfaction at the end of the chapter, but you don't leave them satisfied, because otherwise they might just close the book and they don't have that sense of what an editor wants, which is a propulsive read. So you open up and you crack open something new, a new challenge. It can be tiny or it can be big. It can't always be big, because if it's always big, that's kind of exhausting for the reader. But it always has to be something that you know that you're not going to be satisfied until you turn the next page. And that's what keeps a reader up at night. And that's what the editors want to see. They want to see readers who say, I couldn't put this book down.
No, exactly. Reminder to the audience, and we've got some audience questions coming in I'm going to be putting up in a moment, but reminder to the audience, we've mentioned a couple of books. Joe mentioned a couple of great books when he was speaking a moment ago. All the books that are mentioned, there are links underneath us to check those out, and if you like to pick them up from P&T Knitwear. So again, if you can, go ahead and see if you can make use of that. I have a few more questions, but I want to let the audience in on the action a little bit. Katie, who's with us from Facebook, is wondering, Anne, what did you learn about yourself after writing this book?
Wow, Katie, that's a great question. I learned that I needed a lot of sleep. But actually, seriously, this is not my first novel that I've ever written, but it's the first novel I've ever gotten over the finish line and got to publication, and that has actually broken through. And what I learned, one of the things I have to say along those lines that I learned about myself after finishing the writing of this book is I'm actually glad I waited until I was in my 50s to get to this point in my novel writing. I didn't think I liked that when I was in my 30s and my 40s, and I was trying, and I was very overwhelmed, to be honest, by having full-time jobs and raising a family. And short fiction and essays and collections were much more manageable. So I was very frustrated. I would get very angry at myself. I would get very upset. But when I actually took it to the finish line, what I really learned about myself was I was much more patient with myself as a writer at this stage of the game. I was much more understanding of the process that I would be having to write and rewrite, and just much more enjoyment of that, because I just felt this absolute sense of now. Here it is. I do have the time, and I was afraid that I would never have that headspace again, especially once I had kids. But I did. It came back, and it was just a wonderful kind of exaltation of possibility that came to be. And once you're published and you're out among, as I think Joe said, thousands and thousands of books and thousands of writers, and every bookstore has so many, and you have to want to be part of something
Mm.
for being a part of it. And that was not something I really understood when I was younger, but I fully understood once the dig came into the world. And as much as I love the writing of it, and I love writing, I really love writing, I love editing, all that, I learned that I also love being in conversation around the book with all different people with all different perspectives and using it. Joe talks about the third place of a bookstore. I think there's also a third object, of a book. There's a way in with other humans through the lens of a shared reading experience or a shared entertainment experience, or even a book you haven't read yet, but you're curious about. To be able to connect with somebody about something you're both curious about is a gift.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And and it was, I mean, you talk about sort of this journey sort of writing other works and trying to find time in your life to write and trying to write around having kids and having a career. Um, it was about 25 years, I think, between your NYU MFA and when this book came out. And I guess my question for you is, you've held this book up a couple of times with great pride, but Anne, like, what was it? I mean, there it is. Like, what was it like when it finally happened? I mean, what was it like when you held that book in your hands?
Um, I think it's magic for every single writer to
Yeah,
hold the book in their hands, whether, it's been 25 years since your MFA or not.
yeah.
But yeah, boy, did it feel good. Yeah, I think as lifetime readers, which, since we're all here, we all have been. That's, I'm
Yeah.
sure, what, variety of version, whether it's what you do, Joe Moldover, or you do, Joe in the bookstore, all of us are joined by one thing, as at some point we decided we love books and we love reading. And so to have an intimate part of any piece of that process is pretty amazing. It just brings back that sense of, being 8 or 9 years old and going into the library and looking at the books, that big stack of books, and your eyes get really, really big. And you're like, I will take out all of them, please. And to
Yeah,
imagine that somebody else is at a stack of books in a bookstore in a library and mine is in that stack.
yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. Pretty
Yeah.
amazing. That's fantastic. Question from Kim on Facebook. I'm going to put it up on the screen, and Joe, I'm going to come to you with it first, and then I'll bounce over to you. And Kim is wondering about sort of styles of thriller and is distinguishing between the slow burn and the fast paced. And Joe, I don't know if you have a take on that, slow burn versus fast paced thrillers. If you have a take on how those hit, what you prefer, how those sell. You have any thoughts about that?
I think, I mean, personally, I prefer a slow burn over anything else. You know, I like a lot of, I guess, like what I would call character driven fiction rather than plot driven fiction. So I am more than happy to sort of be pulled along through a character's thoughts. So for me, a slow burn is great. I think generally what sells are, well, I guess I wouldn't say fast-paced thrillers sell. There's always some kind of middle ground or that leans toward one end or the other of a spectrum. I do think faster tends to, as you were saying, and the payoff for the reader, I think, is more immediate. And when authors and we as booksellers, are so pressed to compete for readers' attention, and especially in a world where there are many people vying for our attention at all times. I think, yeah, fast does sell, but it's always going to be kind of on a spectrum of that. There's never just like one or the other.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And what about you? Do you have strong feelings on this front?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm also very drawn to character-driven fiction, including character-driven mystery. And I really love I'm not going to say a middle ground, but I'm going to say what I really love is something that starts as a slow burn that really lets you into the world of the characters and the world of the environment, and then feels maybe on the other side inevitable because of that. So when you get to the stuff that actually goes and it moves fast, it all comes together and you go, yeah, that's what I was waiting for. So if you made me pick, I would pick slow burn. But I think that the really like great books, no matter what genre they are in, have combinations of all of these things. And it's the unique combination with that writer's thumbprint that is what makes the book either successful or, personally successful for me. I'm not talking about commercially successful, or makes me go, oh, I've forgotten about that book. I really do want to see something unique about the way that the characters are drawn, about the way the world is created. And that's what sticks with me.
And question, there are a couple of, I will get to these other audience questions, but just that what you're saying makes me want to ask you, as you were going through the process of bringing this book to publication, did you have feedback from either your agent, your editor, other, publicists, people involved in the process to try to move it in a more sort of quote commercial direction? I mean, were you encouraged, did people say, and, there has to be, kind of like, get to it faster, make it, get to the point faster, move things along, chop up the chapters. What did you feel like there was a commercial push, or did you just sort of, or did people sort of take it the way you wrote it?
Yeah. Well, I will say, I think that the editors who rejected it said,
okay, all right.
Get to the point faster.
Right,
I don't get
right.
to what's, so I would say, is that a suggestion? But this gives me an opportunity to talk about my publisher. They're wonderful. So Counterpoint Press is based in California. They are a really beautiful publisher. They're outside of New York City and outside of what they consider, the big five or big four. But they publish a huge range of work, from very, very literary to very, very, thrillery. But they have been wonderful to work with because they're not a commercial press. They want their books to succeed, and their books do succeed. And as Joe knows, they have a huge range and they're great books. But my editor really wanted the book to work on its own merits. And by that, what I mean is, he didn't say, oh, I'm envisioning somebody buying this in some way because you're going to have, more sex, more violence, any of this. Instead, he really looked at the character and he said, I think that there needs to be a kind of a deeper connection with the villain, quote unquote.
Interesting.
And how are you as a writer going to take my thought and go back and on your own terms make that happen? So that kind of editorial feedback was such a gift for me as a writer. I just loved it.
That's fantastic.
It was fantastic, and it was necessary.
Yeah.
And part of why it was necessary is, here's another tip. If you're using a Greek tragedy for the basis of a novel, you really have to think about what happens on the page, because in Greek tragedy, like, there's a lot of yelling and a lot of dying. So, that's nice. But when it comes to the kind of novel I wanted to write, if everybody was dead in the first third, then I would have very short chapters. So the main character's big foil, her uncle, Christopher, was based on Creon, who was the king who inherited Thebes, in Thebes, Greece, in the ancient myth of Antigone. And he is a very big character, and they invoke the gods, et cetera, et cetera. So with him as my inspiration, my Christopher on the page did too much yelling and was a little, he ramped up too fast. And I saw what my editor was talking about. I said, okay, this is somebody that what I really need to do is make sure that alongside my main character, Antonia, Christopher, even if the reader disagrees with all of his reasons for doing what he does, he has to have his own ethical reasons that he believes in for doing what he did. And that was really important to me. And that helped me sort of slow him down, slow down his, villainy, and make it a much subtler, I think, conclusion.
Yeah.
And in fact, to the point of commercial versus not commercial, I don't want to give anything away about the ending, but it doesn't resolve the way a genre thriller or a genre suspense book resolves. It has much more of a feel of a literary character-driven book, because that was the arc I wanted to explore. As I said in the beginning, this is about a young woman coming to terms with the history that she herself is at odds with, and accepting one way or another a deeper level of who she is and how she'll move forward. This is another thing that my editor identified about the book and said, go for it, don't eliminate it. He said, you know that she's smart enough to figure everything out, but you need to have her develop to have a why, to have a reason, a meaning behind having figured everything out. And that's an editor who really cares about a character.
That's great. What fantastic editorial feedback.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. So I know we've some other crafty questions here, but Anne is sort of past the point of writing this book and is into the world of the book being in the being out there and doing book events. I love book events. It's one of the things I really, really missed during the pandemic. And Joe, you, as I said at the beginning of the show, you are events and outreach manager. Talk book events with me for just a second. I would love to hear. First of all, I would just love to hear, is there something that sticks in your mind as an all-time great book event that you have facilitated? Something that sticks in your mind as being like wild or strange or just like fabulous that you have facilitated? What comes to mind?
Well, immediately, we were very lucky to host the launch for Catherine Lacey's latest book, Biography of X, which, if you haven't heard anything about that or read anything about that, it is a fictional biography of an enigmatic artist known only as X. It's told by X's partner, who is responding to an unauthorized biography written about X. And so she's rewriting that story. And kind of the larger thing about the novel is that at the same time, this takes place at a point where the South, which had previously seceded again from the U.S. and split the country into three factions: the South, the West, and the Northeast. The South has re-entered the United States, and she's having to go back into the Southern territories, which sort of closed themselves off into a kind of theocratic nation state. And so it's dealing with everything I think that Catherine has been thinking about in her work, but especially the question of personhood and identity. This X character kind of wears a lot of hats and has no real fixed background. So that's also part of the difficulty of really writing an authoritative biography, and thinking about how does one know a person truly. And so Catherine's publicist had this fantastic idea to have, rather than Catherine lead the conversation, have a bunch of people play Catherine. Yeah, and they sort of switched throughout. It was really, really wonderful. And again, if you couldn't tell, I'm a big fan of Catherine's work. So it really, a lot of times, and again, to kind of everything we've been saying, like, book events usually are sort of like the fireside chat and conversation method, which is, always really wonderful. And the conversations are generative and it allows you to experience the book in a new way. But that sort of just like really propelled the experience of the book in a fantastic way, where like the content really came alive in the way, like, like we always think about content and form and how they play with each other. But this was sort of like, breaking the form of its form as a novel and being, sort of a part of the book existing in the world in a real tangible way of like, okay, we're all pretending, we're all sort of in on the fiction of what's happening here. But it's all kind of unscripted. We have no idea what these Catherines are going to say. Yeah. It was absolutely wonderful.
That sounds fantastic. And that sounds totally unique. That's really cool.
It was a good time.
Very cool. We're starting to run up against time, and I want to have time to ask you, both of you, for book recommendations. And I'm going to try to synthesize. We have a number of audience questions I'm going to try to synthesize to try to make everybody happy. So I think there's a sort of a number of craft questions I want to kind of put together for you. And so we'll see if you can kind of jujitsu, like, kind of handle all of them at once. But audience members are wondering, yeah, exactly. Who inspired you? What authors inspired you? And then now that you are an author yourself, what does your process look like? Um, how long did it take you to do the research for this book? And on the back end, do you read your reviews? So that is sort of a series of sub questions all about being an author.
Yeah,
Do as
absolutely.
you will.
Okay. So, well, there's authors that have inspired me in general throughout my writing career, and there's authors that inspired me for writing the dig specifically. So I'm going to go with the dig specifically because why not, right? So I was very, very inspired by Tana French. I think she's incredible. Gillian Flynn, Megan Abbott. These are all writers that take a particular slice of the mystery genre, and they're deeply psychological and deeply world building and relationship building in their work. So these were authors that I just thought, as far as contemporary writers, if, this sort of slice in between literary, suspense, mystery, thriller, the Venn diagram of all of them, these are writers I think that get it, that do it really beautifully. Jane Harper, The Dry, was another huge inspiration. That's a coincidence. It's a letter D beginning, but the way that she handled her material and the atmosphere, etc., very, very inspirational. I loved that. Jean Kwok was Searching for Sylvie Lee. That was a really inspiring book. And that came out just a few years ago. Her new book, The Leftover Woman, is just out too. So there's a recommendation that I can add into the mix. What was the second question? My process now?
Your process, and how do you do it?
Yeah, doing the next one.
Well, what's your writing process, sort of whatever that means to you?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm one of these people who still handwrites their first drafts. So I'm very particular about what kind of paper I'll use, which I think a lot of writers are. I like to use tablet, there's tablet notebooks, but I only like to use wide ruled. I don't like to use college ruled. I like to use white paper with the blue lines on them. So I like to get the 50-page ones with the wide rule, because I feel like it's a great balance between, it takes me a while to fill one of those up, but it's not so big that it takes me so long. So I feel this great sense of accomplishment when I have gotten 50 handwritten pages. Then my second draft is the typing of that into the computer, but that's not just typing, that's a really sort of organizing and seeing what's messed up and seeing, what doesn't work and all of that. And then I will print out that, and then I'll handwrite my next edits, and then I'll go back and I will do that on the computer again.
Wow.
And that's how I get to the draft that is usually what I would consider not the zero draft, but the first draft. So it's sort of 3 iterations before draft 1 that I get to.
That is intense. That's fascinating. And what about the reviews? Do you read the reviews or not?
I wish I had so many reviews. I would say, oh, I have so many reviews, I just can't read them all. So I think I would answer to that is I don't read that. Well, I will say this: I don't read Goodreads, and I don't read the Amazon reviews. Those 100% no, because I just can't. But yeah, I mean, I read them, and then if somebody doesn't like what I did, I'll feel sad for a little while, and then I'll be like, okay, I'm going to refer you back to the part of the conversation where I said I'm glad I'm in my 50s when I have my debut novel and not when I'm younger, because I kind of have a little perspective on that, because once you've raised kids, you've been called much worse.
That is so true. Publishers Weekly had some very nice things to say, and I think we posted that in the chat, so we will share that. So
and of course, the biggest review, the positive reviews that meant the most to me were the indie booksellers. The fact that it was on the Indie Next list for March means that booksellers, who I think across the country have the greatest insights into what people actually like to read. There were so many beautiful statements from booksellers who were very moved by this book, and that was like the most moving thing to me. I was so grateful.
Yeah,
that meant the world to me.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of booksellers, as we're winding, I will say 2 of the authors that you've mentioned, Megan Abbott and Jean Kwok, we had on the show. We've posted their interviews below for people who want to check those authors out. But speaking of book selling, let's sell some books. Joe, you're the professional, so I'm going to go to you. And a reminder to the audience, as we're talking about recommended books, there's going to be links in the comments to pick them up from P&T Knitwear. That is the only place you should be purchasing from today, not an online retailer that begins with A. So follow the links if you can. And Joe, what are you reading? What are you excited about?
Well, I am right now reading, and it won't come out for a little while, James, Percival Everett's new novel, which is a retelling of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn from the perspective of Jim. It's really wonderful. I love Percival's work. This is also the first book he's not published with Grey Wolf. He's been publishing with them for decades. And so I don't want to say it's his first foray into the mainstream because he's quite well known. And, you know, like he has a movie coming out, an adaptation of his novel Erasure. That's going to be really fantastic. But yeah, so I'm reading James. It comes out, I believe, in the spring. It's awesome. It's, you know, as good a place to start as any with Percival Everett, with, you know, sort of a backlist as long as his. There is no bad place to start. So you may as well start with the most recent thing. I've also been reading Cross Stitch, which is Yasmina Barrera's first novel. It's not her first book, but it is her first foray into fiction. It's about a woman who finds out that a childhood friend of hers has died, and she is thinking back on the first trip that she and this friend and another friend took, and sort of, you know, trying to think of all the warning signs that might have been there. And at the same time, she's thinking about stitching. You know, it's like the tradition of embroidery in Mexico, the act of, you know, stitching itself in the metaphorical sense. You know, if you haven't read Yasmina Barrera, her book on lighthouses was a great essay collection that focused on lighthouses. There's 8 essays, I believe. And she sort of really, it's kind of great in that she applies that kind of really granular nonfiction lens to, you know, to embroidery in this really natural way, where it doesn't feel like I've written a novel around this subject, but like that this obsession that the character has with it is who the character is, and it feels very natural. And it's a really beautiful book. I also recently finished Hilary Leichter's second book, Terrace Story, which is about a couple who discovers that they have a magical terrace, you know, in their very small Brooklyn apartment that only appears when a good friend of theirs comes around. And so they start inviting that friend over more, and it begins to strain the friendship for kind of obvious reasons. It's, you know, I don't say this lightly, it's a perfect book. It is really just such a beautiful, quick read. You know, a lot of times she gets compared to Kafka, but the epigraph in this book, which comes from Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, is certainly appropriate. It has that kind of same narrative propulsion that Woolf does. And it's really funny. She's just a funny writer. You know, and that's a fantastic book that everyone should especially pick up from us. We have plenty of signed copies of Terrace Story. And then, you know, as a bookseller, I am reading many books months ahead, and then after the fact, you know, I read The Five Sorrowful Mysteries of Andy Africa. That was put out by Bloomsbury a few months ago. It's an excellent novel by Stephen Buoro about a young man who is living in Nigeria, and it's about, you know, kind of examining the effects of colonialism on contemporary Nigerians and contemporary Africans. It's also got one of like the funniest openings to a novel I've read in a long time. Stephen's a debut writer, a really wonderful, kind person. So I highly recommend that as well. And then I'll give, I also recommend Biography X. You should definitely pick that up. And then I've got, I guess, 3 more books. So Max Porter's newest book, Shy, is really wonderful. It's about a young man named Shy who is sort of in this home for wayward boys, and it's sort of his last chance. And he's escaped from the house and is wandering around at night and kind of thinking about his life and everything that's led him here. You know, it's a really tender book. And Max Porter is working in that tradition of like the high modernists. So it is lyrical in the very best sense of the word. I also recommend Jess Rose, The New Earth, that came out in March. Like if you liked Franny and Zoe, this is that book on steroids. It's the same kind of glass family dysfunction set in contemporary America. Just absolutely excellent stuff. And then the last one is The All-American, Joe Milan Jr. That was another debut novel about a young boy living in Seattle who gets deported back to Korea, where he was originally from, but had emigrated to the United States when he was very young. But he does not speak Korean. He has no cultural ties to the country, but he's thrust back into military service. And so he is sort of in this limbo space, physically, culturally, and also bureaucratically. And it's, also really funny. I could keep going on. There are many books that I would like to have the time to recommend, but that's kind of the great joy of book selling, is that we get to recommend as many books as we possibly can every day. So
fantastic, thank you for those. Those are great recommendations. Anne, from your end, books that you're excited about that you'd like to recommend to the audience?
Well, I have to run and get all of those books that Joe just described.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I mean, I mentioned a couple. Another one that kind of in the same vein of some of the ones that Joe was talking about that I recently read and just adore is Half-Life of a Stolen Sister by Rachel Cantor. And this is a explosion of the Bronte family biography, basically. It is fiction, but she's writing about the Bronte sisters and their brother, but she just sort of releases them from history and sets them afoot in New York City and in England and everywhere. And she uses all kinds of techniques to talk about their relationships and their development, from imaginary dating profiles for the Bronte father through letters and emails. But the thing is, it's really moving and really emotional and really beautiful. And I felt like I got an inside look into Charlotte and Emily and Anne from a writer who clearly adored them and adored having the opportunity to just be kind of freeform with who they were. So I found it to be a really lovely and moving, as well as interesting piece of fiction.
Fantastic. Thank you. Links are in the chat, everybody, so you know what to do. We are running down on time. The last question of the show, always for the bookseller. So, Joe, success as an independent bookseller is part luck, part hard work, and part what else? What's the third ingredient?
Gentle prodding.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, as a bookseller, our job, is to hand sell books. When people come in asking for recommendations, we always want to try to meet them where they are. Whatever they want, we will try to steer them in the best direction possible. However, there are so many books that exist. We can't stock them all. No one can. And there are many books that, within that we think those people should read and would enjoy. And so oftentimes, as much as it is meeting readers halfway and steering them in the direction of things they want, we're also going to try to sell them on things that they don't know that they want yet, or don't even think they want. And hopefully that way we can build a relationship with them, and we can help broaden the scope of what they read and what they come to enjoy, and that they find new avenues and subject matter and ideas that they didn't know existed, or that could coexist within their sort of frame of reference. And that all ultimately has to be done, as I said, gently, but consistently. Like, we do want people to come in often. We do want to hand sell people. We do want to put books in their hands and say, like, go read this right now. So yeah.
Fantastic. That's a great answer. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for being here and speaking with me today. This has been delightful. And Burt, congratulations on The Dig, on your debut novel, Worth the Wait, and all the congratulations on success, and all the best for it moving ahead. Joe Dimas, thank you so much for coming to us from P&T Knitwear. And to the audience, please support P&T Knitwear by buying some or all of the many books we've mentioned during this show from the store online. And come back next week. We have Angela Jackson Brown joining us with the Morgenstern Bookstore in Bloomington, Indiana. So same time next week. Support great authors, support independent bookselling, stay well, and keep reading. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Happy 150.